Japan achieved preeminence in the Asia-Pacific region by gaining support from their former Entente allies. However, during World War II, Japan found itself fighting against many of these nations. While this was often attributed to imperial aggression, Japan's expansion is a complex and often overlooked story. American crypto analysts managed to break Japanese naval codes early in the Pacific War, giving the U.S. Navy advance knowledge of Japan's plan to attack Midway in 1942. This allowed the Americans to prepare their forces accordingly. During the interwar period, Japan faced economic challenges due to the Great Depression, leading to rising influence within the country's far-right circles, particularly the military. The Mukden incident in 1931, a false flag event, enabled Japan's Kwantung Army to seize Manchuria and establish the puppet state of Manchukuo, providing resources and acting as a buffer against the Soviet Far East. By 1936, extremist elements known as the Young Officers carried out assassinations and coup d'état plots, further empowering the military within Japan's cabinet. The signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact in November secured Japan for future conflict with the Soviet Union, with Germany shifting its Far East Asian policy in favor of Japan. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in July 1937 following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, escalating into a full-scale conflict with China. Japanese atrocities on Chinese civilians and occupations drew condemnation from the West, leading to increased embargoes. Despite a humiliating defeat at Kokun-Gol in September 1939 by the Soviet Red Army, Japan saw an opportunity to establish a new order in East Asia with Germany's invasion of Poland. The concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was advocated, aiming to include various South Seas areas. During Germany's conquest of Europe, Japan focused on acquiring territories to support their co-prosperity ambitions, expanding beyond their gains in China. Japan gained control of French Indochina with Germany's approval on September 22, 1940, and 4 days later, the Vichy French authorities yielded to Japanese demands. The following day, Japan entered into the Tripartite Pact, forming a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy against the United States, which had been imposing harsh sanctions and embargoes on vital resources such as machine tools, aviation fuel, and scrap metal. The fear of a possible oil embargo drove Japan further towards establishing its co-prosperity sphere, seen as crucial for their ongoing war in China. Back in Japan, the government employed intense repression and propaganda to rally public support for the empire. Anti-subversion laws and measures to control the intelligentsia were enforced to discourage any opposition. Education was strictly regulated to indoctrinate the youth and groom them as future assets for Japan's dominance in Asia and the Pacific. Imperial propagandists also incorporated Shinto religious traditions to enhance the state-sanctioned cult centered around Emperor Hirohito, known as Showa, under whose name Japanese fighters chanted their famous Banzai battle cry. To secure resources in the co-prosperity sphere, Japan established a national resource zone stretching from Burma to Melanesia. The army defended the newly conquered territories, while the navy protected its ocean lanes. Japan's withdrawal from the Washington Naval Limitation Treaty in 1937 allowed them to construct large battleships like the Yamato and the Musashi, but senior staff questioned the wisdom of these super battleships and advocated shifting focus towards air power and submarines, essential for the National Defense Zone. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a proponent of naval aviation, played a key role in planning Operation Z, the attack on Pearl Harbor. This operation aimed to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers and quickly invade and occupy the planned southern resource zones. However, inter-service tensions between the Army and the Navy persisted, with the Army insisting on prioritizing the Chinese theater while the Navy sought to advance in the new South Sea areas. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, targeting military bases and the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack resulted in significant losses for the U.S. Navy but galvanized America into action. Japan swiftly invaded the Philippines, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian regions, meeting little resistance from the Allied nations. Japan's competent commanders successfully executed surprise invasions, such as the Malay Operation, which led to the capture of the entire peninsula in just 70 days. However, as the war escalated, Japanese authorities began to worry about the potential retaliation from the U.S. aircraft carriers, which survived the Pearl Harbor attack. In response to the Doolittle raid, launched from the USS Hornet, Japan conducted Operation Sago to search for American airmen who had taken shelter in China. This was followed by a strategic withdrawal after the Battle of the Coral Sea, where Japan's navy suffered its first setback. Admiral Yamamoto realized the danger posed by the U.S. carriers and sought to regain the initiative by establishing a new base of operations for attacking U.S. bases in Hawaii. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 saw Japan's premier aircraft carriers and a heavy cruiser destroyed, signaling a turning point in the Pacific War. The tables turned completely for Admiral Matono Nagaki, observing from his flagship, as they were now compelled to cope with the worst-case scenario. This served as a lesson that war's outcomes are unpredictable. After the defeat at Midway, inter-service rivalries resurfaced, and the Army, misled about the battle's aftermath, initially believed the fleet was in good condition. Meanwhile, the Allies gained confidence and momentum from recent victories, embarking on their island-hopping campaign. Japanese military leadership recognized their forces' inability to adapt quickly to the new demands of combat. However, attempts to update their arsenal in 1942 were hampered by a lack of resources, resulting in unchanged weapons and limited quality control. Material shortages forced Japan to prioritize production for aircraft and ships, neglecting other necessary armaments. In late 1942, Allied landings in Guadalcanal isolated the Japanese into pockets of resistance, allowing the Allies to bypass them for larger targets. In 1943, the Japanese faced fierce fighting during the defense of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, suffering heavy losses due to the superior firepower of the Allied forces. By 1944, the Japanese Navy lost naval superiority after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. The lack of Japanese fire support weakened their defense of the Mariana and Palau Islands, leading to heavy losses. Throughout the war, the Japanese demonstrated their fighting spirit and determination to defend occupied territories. Despite their tenacity, the Japanese military faced increasing failures in late 1944 and 1945. The island-hopping campaigns wore away Japanese garrisons, leaving many abandoned. The U.S. launched a firebombing campaign across Tokyo in March 1945, causing extensive destruction and casualties. The Allied forces closed in, and Japan resorted to all means necessary to defend the home islands. The U.S. invasion of Okinawa resulted in heavy casualties for both sides. Japan's Second Fleet's suicidal attack, known as Operation Tango, failed after their naval codes were decrypted. The Potsdam Conference called for Japan's unconditional surrender, which they initially ignored. However, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union's entry into the war, Japan's emperor finally called for peace on August 15, 1945, leading to the end of the war.